Every nation on Earth is trapped in a financial system that was never designed to be escaped. The United States currently owes over $36 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. And the entire planet is carrying a total debt load of over $315 trillion, more than 3 times the size of the global economy. But here's the paradox that should terrify you. If every country is in debt, and almost every citizen is in debt, who exactly are we paying? The answer is not what you think. When you follow the money, you discover a disturbing truth. The world does not owe money to aliens. It owes money to itself, but 4 architects across 3 centuries designed it this way, deliberately. They built a system where debt is never meant to be repaid, where governments borrow forever, where interest flows eternally upward to a select few, and where the people who designed the trap profit from every payment, every crisis, and every bailout. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The meetings happened, the contracts exist, the mechanisms are public record. When you understand how this machine was built, you will realize that the $36 trillion national debt is not a problem to be solved. It is the system working exactly as designed. Let me show you the 4 architects, the 4 specific moments in history when this trap was engineered, and why no government on Earth can ever get out. To understand this, you must first unlearn what the world has taught you to believe. You are told that national debt is a failure of governance, a mistake made by politicians who spend too much money. That is false. The debt is not a byproduct of the system. The debt is the system. Before 1694, debt was temporary. If a king could not pay, he defaulted, lenders lost money, and the system reset. But the modern financial architecture replaced that with something far more profitable: perpetual debt. Think of it this way. The interest payments are not penalties. They are effectively the rent that citizens pay to use the currency. Every dollar in your pocket is a receipt of debt owed by someone else. If all debt were paid off tomorrow, the money supply would vanish. This mechanism ensures that wealth flows continuously from those who work to those who own the bonds. It is not a flaw. It is the design. And it began with one man who realized that a loan that is never repaid is far more valuable than one that is. Let me take you back to the moment the trap was first set. The year is 1694. England is exhausted. King William III is desperate for money to fight a war against France, but the royal treasury is empty. In the old world, kings borrowed money like you or I would. They went to merchants, took a loan, and promised to pay it back. If they couldn't pay, they defaulted. Lenders lost everything, and the system reset. Debt was temporary. It was a problem that had to be solved. Enter William Paterson, a Scottish merchant with an idea that would change civilization forever. He approached the king with a radical proposal. He and his wealthy friends would lend the government £1.2 million, a massive fortune at the time. But here was the twist. The king would never have to repay the principal. Instead, the government would only have to pay interest at 8% a year, forever. And to manage this arrangement, they would create a new, private institution, the Bank of England. This was the moment the foundation was laid. Before Paterson, debt was a finite contract between 2 people. After Paterson, debt became a permanent feature of the state. The brilliance of the scheme was seductive. The king got his war money immediately, without raising taxes drastically. The merchants got a guaranteed stream of income, backed by the tax power of the state, that would flow to them and their descendants for eternity. They didn't want their money back. They wanted the rent. This model, perpetual debt serviced by perpetual taxation, became the blueprint for every central bank in the world. It turned the government from a sovereign entity into a permanent renter of its own currency, and it ensured that from that day forward, the national debt would only grow, never disappear. By the year 1815, the foundation of perpetual debt was set, but the trap was still local. It took a second architect to make it inescapable on a global scale. Enter Nathan Rothschild. While Napoleon was fighting across Europe, Rothschild was building something far more powerful than an army: the international bond market. Before him, government debt was a static contract between a ruler and a lender. He turned it into a liquid commodity that could be bought and sold like grain or gold. Here is the innovation that tightened the noose. When the British government needed massive amounts of money to fight the war, Rothschild did not just lend it from his own vault. He bought the government bonds, and then he sold them to a network of investors, pension funds, and other banks across Europe. This created the secondary market. Suddenly, British debt was not just owned by a few merchants in London. It was owned by French aristocrats, German bankers, and Dutch traders. This innovation changed the mathematics of power. Before this, a king could technically default on a single lender and survive the embarrassment. But Rothschild made the debt so interconnected that a default would no longer just hurt a creditor. It would crash the entire financial system. He weaponized the network. By distributing the debt, he ensured that the government could never walk away from it. If they stopped paying, they would not just lose funding, they would trigger a continental economic collapse. This was the moment debt shifted from a financial tool into a mechanism of total control. Governments were no longer truly sovereign. They were subservient to the bond market, and the banking families sat at the center of the web, collecting a cut of every transaction, ensuring that the interest payments kept flowing, regardless of who sat on the throne. By the early 20th century, the trap faced a physical limitation. Governments wanted to borrow endlessly, but there was only so much gold in the vaults to lend. To make the debt truly infinite, the system needed a new engine. Enter the third architect, J.P. Morgan. Following the financial panic of 1907, Morgan and a small group of elite bankers realized they needed a lender of last resort that had no physical limits. In 1910, they gathered in total secrecy at a private club on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, they drafted the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve System. This was not just a central bank, it was an alchemy machine. Before 1913, if the government wanted to borrow $1 million, a bank had to have $1 million in gold or deposits to lend. The Federal Reserve Act changed the physics of money. Now, when the government needs money, it issues a bond. The Federal Reserve simply creates the currency out of thin air to buy that bond. This closed the loop. The government issues debt, the central bank prints currency to buy it, and the government spends the new currency into circulation. This is the moment the infinite loop was activated. Money was no longer a store of value. It became a receipt of debt. Every dollar in your wallet is a Federal Reserve note, a piece of evidence that money was borrowed into existence. This mechanism removed the ceiling on how much debt could be created. As long as the government is willing to borrow, and the Fed is willing to print, the debt can grow forever. Morgan died the same year the system was finalized, but his legacy was the ultimate financial weapon, a system where the debt supply is theoretically infinite, and therefore, the interest payments extracted from the population can also be infinite. By the late 1970s, the trap faced a new crisis. Inflation was soaring, and faith in the dollar was collapsing. The system needed an enforcer to lock the door and throw away the key. Enter the fourth architect, Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve. In 1979, to kill inflation, Volcker did the unthinkable. He raised interest rates to 20%. This saved the dollar, but it triggered a catastrophe for anyone holding debt. Developing nations across Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina had borrowed billions in cheap dollars during the previous decade. Suddenly, their interest payments tripled. They could not pay. In 1982, Mexico threatened to default. This should have been the moment the banks took a loss. But Volcker and the international financial establishment introduced a new rule: restructure, do not forgive. Instead of writing off the bad debt, they used the International Monetary Fund to lend these desperate nations just enough money to pay the interest owed to American banks. But this money came with brutal conditions. To get the loans, countries had to cut spending, sell off national assets, and privatize their industries. This was the final innovation. Debt became a weapon of sovereignty. The structural adjustment programs ensured that these nations would remain in debt forever, forcing them to orient their entire economies toward servicing interest payments to Western creditors. Volcker proved that the system cares more about the integrity of the debt than the survival of the debtor. He established the precedent that is still used today: when the burden becomes too heavy, you are not allowed to go bankrupt. You are simply refinanced into a longer, heavier chain. The trap was now complete, permanent, global, infinite, and legally inescapable. So, who exactly is on the receiving end of these payments? Who are they? It is not a secret cabal meeting in a smoke-filled room. The reality is much more banal and much more powerful. They are institutional capital. When we say the United States owes $36 trillion, that debt is held in the form of treasury bonds. Who owns them? About $20 trillion is held by the public, but that does not mean you and me. It means massive asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. It means pension funds, insurance conglomerates, and foreign central banks. Here is the mechanism of extraction. You go to work, the government takes taxes from your paycheck. You assume that money pays for roads, schools, or the military. But a massive portion of it, now exceeding $1 trillion every single year, is siphoned off solely to pay the interest on the debt. That money flows directly from the working class, who pay taxes, to the asset-holding class, who own the bonds. It is the largest, most continuous wealth transfer in human history. To you, the national debt looks like a crisis, but to them, it is a business model. Every dollar of debt that terrifies you is a risk-free asset on their balance sheet. This is why the system never fixes the debt. They do not want the debt to be paid off. If the debt disappeared, their assets would vanish, and the global money supply would collapse. They need the debt to grow, because their power grows with it. Fast forward to right now, the year 2025. The trap has finally snapped shut. For decades, economists warned about a debt spiral. That is no longer a theory. It is the mathematical reality we are living in today. Here is the data point that signals the end of the old era. For the first time in history, the United States government is spending more money just to pay interest on the national debt than it spends on the entire national defense. Let that sink in. The government is paying more to wealthy bondholders than it pays for the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines combined. The math is broken. The government collects roughly $5 trillion in taxes, but it spends over $6 trillion. The gap is covered by, you guessed it, more borrowing. But here is the catch. Who is left to buy all this new debt? Foreign nations are backing away. The only buyer left with infinite pockets is the Federal Reserve. So, the central bank must print more currency to buy the government's debt. This floods the system with new dollars, diluting the value of every dollar you worked for. This is the silent theft. The architects of this system know they cannot repay the $36 trillion in real terms, so they have chosen the only option left: inflation. They will pay back every single dollar owed, but those dollars will be worth a fraction of what they were when you earned them. They are not defaulting on the debt, they are defaulting on the value of your money. The trap is no longer about whether the system will break. It is about how much purchasing power must be stolen from you to keep it running. You might be thinking, I will simply opt out. I will not borrow money. I will not play their game. But the architects anticipated that. They designed the system so that opting out is effectively financial suicide. Consider the mechanism of the credit score. This is not a measure of your wealth or your moral character. It is strictly a measure of how well you service debt for the banks. If you choose not to participate, if you carry zero debt, you become a financial ghost. Without a score, you cannot buy a home. You often cannot rent an apartment. You may be denied employment. The system punishes you for not being a debtor. Furthermore, the transition to a fully digital financial system is the final bar of the cage. Every transaction is tracked. Every dollar of income is monitored. Taxes are deducted before you even touch your paycheck. You are not free to leave. To function in society, you must use their currency, which loses value every year. You must use their banks, which lend out your deposits to create more debt. And you must pay taxes, which are used to pay interest to the very institutions that designed the trap. It is not a voluntary participation. It is coerced compliance. The system is designed to be the only viable option for survival. You are free to move around inside the cage, but you are never given the key to open the door. 4 architects. 3 centuries. 1 inescapable system. You now understand that the $36 trillion debt is not an accident. It is the foundation of the world economy. You cannot vote it away. You cannot protest it away. The trap is complete. However, while you cannot stop the machine, you do not have to be its fuel. The system depends on you remaining financially illiterate. It depends on you saving your hard-earned wealth in a currency that they are actively destroying. Here is your exit strategy. It is not about leaving society. It is about changing your position within it. First, stop storing your life energy in fiat currency. When the Federal Reserve prints trillions to buy government debt, cash is a melting ice cube. You must move your wealth into real assets, things that cannot be printed by a central bank. Gold, silver, land. Profitable businesses. Bitcoin. When the currency is debased, real assets do not lose value. They reprice higher in dollar terms. Second, learn to use their weapon against them. The system punishes savers, but it rewards debtors who hold fixed-rate debt on real assets. If you have a 30-year fixed mortgage on a home and inflation soars to 10%, the real value of your debt decreases. You are using their inflation to pay off your liability. Third, education is your only defense. The architects rely on the fact that schools do not teach money. They train you to be a worker and a consumer, not a capitalist. The $36 trillion will never be repaid. It will be inflated away. That is a mathematical certainty. You can either be the collateral damage in that process, or you can position yourself to survive the greatest wealth transfer in history. If this video helped you see the invisible bars of the cage, subscribe to the channel. We are going to continue decoding the system piece by piece. Because in a world of manufactured illusions, the only true freedom is understanding exactly how the machine works.